Hello and welcome to the 7th Annual Effective Practices Conference. I am Kim Borman, Executive Director of the Boston Women's Workforce Council. Let me start by thanking our 100% Talent Compact signers for joining us today, and particularly our anchor signers, State Street Corporation, Mass General Brigham, Mass Mutual, Putnam Investments, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, and 2 new anchor signers who joined in 2021. Arbella Insurance Group, and Red Hat Software. To all, we appreciate your continued generosity and ongoing commitment to closing the gender and racial wage gap in Greater Boston. We started planning this conference in July by visiting different venues for our first in-person event in 2 years. Then reality set in, and we realized that re-entry to the office, social gatherings, and even professional sporting events were going to take on a different flavor. Vaccine cards uploaded, masks worn indoors, social distancing, limiting attendance. The new normal is still evolving and the future of work with it. To that end, today's program is meant to show how the lessons we as employers learned to keep our employees safe, healthy, and productive can be used to bring equity to whatever the workplace ends up looking like in 2022 and beyond. In a few moments, we will be releasing highlights of our 2021 wage gap data results. We have an excellent panel organized to discuss those findings and their implications for CEOs and managers alike. Finally, we will close with remarks from our keynote speaker, Reshma Kewal-Ramani, CEO and President of Vertex. But first, I have the pleasure of welcoming one of our illustrious co-chairs of the council, Evelyn Murphy, to share a few remarks with our audience.
Thank you, Kim. I have the honor and pleasure today of introducing Mayor Michelle Wu. Now, the print and the electronic media have been filled with stories about Mayor Wu, about her historic election, about her election night speech, about her comments after being sworn in, and I don't want to bore you by repeating all of that. But I do want to draw your attention to one phrase she used right after she was sworn in. She started by saying essentially, Boston doesn't have to be the way it has always been. And then she said, and I quote, "We can chart a new course grounded in justice and opportunity." And that's the essence of the 100% Talent Compact. The signers of that compact pledged to the mayor that they're going to look under their hood, under their roof, and if they find racial and gender wage gaps, they're going to do something about that and eventually eliminate them. So the work of the Women's Workforce Council is the linchpin in Mayor Wu's ambitious and I think invigorating agenda for Boston. Now, I've known Michelle Wu for many years. I like this woman. She's got integrity, and she's got real courage. You know, it takes courage to run for high political offices, like being mayor of Boston, with all the family responsibilities that she has. And it takes courage to run for office, for significant offices in these divisive political times. But she's not full of bravado about herself. She simply wants to create a Boston grounded in justice and opportunity. She's taken on this role as mayor of Boston for all the right reasons, and we can help her be wildly successful with her goals if we are successful in eliminating and reducing the gender and racial wage gaps. So on behalf of the co-chair, my co-chair, Kathy Minahan, Executive Director Kim Borman and her team, all the council members, and myself, welcome, Mayor Michelle Wu.
Thank you, Evelyn. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Wu, Mayor of Boston. It's my honor to welcome you to the Boston Women's Workforce Council 7th Annual Effective Practices Conference. Making change will take all of us working together in partnership. For years, the Boston Women's Workforce Council has been the city's partner in reporting on the gender and racial wage gap data. And with this conference today, I'm thrilled that our 2021 report is set to be released. I'm so grateful for this partnership, and I know that together we can continue this work not only to empower and advance women, but to make Boston a city for everyone. Closing the gender wage gap and racial wealth gap is important to create systemic change for our residents, families, and communities. This 2021 report will give us important data on how to build economic equity for women and help convey the urgency of this work citywide. We must tackle both the visible and invisible barriers that women face. My hope is that this conference will allow for important conversations and discussions. Let our takeaways empower all of us to amplify women's voices and celebrate the impact women continue to make in our city. Women have played such a pivotal role in redefining what's possible in Boston by serving at so many levels of leadership and organizing in every community. With the continued collaboration between the City of Boston and the Boston Women's Workforce Council, I look forward to accomplishing even more together. We need more women at the highest levels of leadership. And so I want to thank the more than 250 100% compact signers, Executive Director Kim Borman, and co-chairs Kathy Minahan and again, Evelyn Murphy. The City of Boston appreciates your work and this important public-private partnership. Thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you, Mayor Wu, for your inspiring remarks. We are eager to work with you and your administration to close the gender and racial wage gap in Boston. It is now time to present the results from this year's wage gap measurement analysis. Kathy Minahan, our other very distinguished council co-chair, will report the key takeaways. Please note that the full report will be sent to you electronically immediately after this presentation.
Thanks so much, Kim. Good morning, everyone. I am so pleased to be here to share the results of the third biannual, I should say, report of wage gaps in the greater Boston area as measured by the Boston Women's Workforce Council. And I'm so happy to be here to deliver the messages from this report to you today. Every 2 years, as you know, the BWWC conducts an anonymous wage gap analysis to measure the gender and racial wage gaps in greater Boston. A couple things to keep in mind about this. First of all, while you do see wage gap data from other places, it's all provided by employees themselves using and is matched to census data. Our data comes directly from employers who have signed the Boston Compact, showing that they are really concerned about reducing and or eliminating the wage gaps in Boston. Other kinds of wage gaps you may see may cover bigger areas, but use employee provided data. Our data covers greater Boston out to the 495 circle. So it creates a regional wage gap measure, which you're not going to find other places either. And finally, it contains information about wage gaps by race for all employees, not just women. So with that background in mind, what happened in 2021? It was a really great report process. Our 2021 data reflect a 10% increase in compact signer participation. We have data on, confidential data for sure, on 156,000 employees, which makes up about 13.5% of the greater Boston workforce. That's 14% more employee records than we've had earlier in the 2019 reporting cycle. And we also have notched a big change in terms of the total pay accounted for by that group. That's $17.4 billion in annual salaries paid to the workforce on which the data was provided by employers. That reflects a 12% increase in overall salaries for both men and women since 2019. That's a little bit of good news, I think, given all that we've heard about the pandemic's impact on the labor force. Now going into the demographics of our sample, we see that, as in the past, we have records on a workforce that's more highly women, comprised of women, than the overall Boston workforce. Our compact data set is 58% women versus 42% men. The greater Boston workforce is nearly equivalent, men and women. As again, this is what we've seen in the past as well, and reflects, I think, the fact that the employers who've signed the Boston Compact and who have reported on their employees' wage data are more focused on the women in their workforce, in that they're a larger share of their workforce. So what were the results? As we measured in 2019, the overall gender wage gap is 30 cents. Now, what does that mean? It means that women in the sample earned 70 cents on the dollar of a man's pay. That's the same as it was in 2019. And while no one's satisfied with that as a wage gap, it's also pretty good news given all that we've heard about the impact on women of the pandemic and employment issues that have been important during the pandemic. Moving then to the gender wage gap information by job category, we see that depending on the jobs that women are in, they can either make something similar to men, as in the case of laborers and helpers, where women actually out-earn men, or they can have a very wide wage gap, in the case of service workers in particular, at 50 cents. Executives are kind of interesting this year as compared with 2019. While we see that there are a good share of women in the executive category, their wage gap is 26 cents this year. It was a little bit higher in 2019. These wage gap data reflect all earners in various job categories, but we're kind of interested in what happened to the wage gap by race. Okay, so what happened then to the racial wage gap in 2021? In 2019, the wage gap was 25 cents. That is, people of color, as compared with white employees, made about 75 cents on the dollar earned by a white employee. In 2021, that dropped by 1 cent. Not a big drop, but at least going in the right direction, from 25 cents to 24 cents. We also saw, when we looked at gender racial wage gaps, a great deal of difference depending on how employees' racial categories varied. White men, $1 on a dollar. Asian women, white women, 70 cents on the dollar. Hispanic, Latina women, 45 cents on a dollar, with a variation in between. The salaries of women of various races compared to the salaries of white men varied considerably. We've been looking at salaries, regular salary income. Now let's take a look at performance pay, that is, bonuses that are earned by employees. Our 2021 wage gap data actually tells us that for every dollar of performance pay earned by a man, women only earn 31 cents. Now, some of this is because of the jobs that women are concentrated in. Those jobs are not typically rewarded by bonuses in some cases. However, even when you look at executive categories where bonuses are common, you still find this very big difference between men and women in terms of performance pay. On average, cash performance compensation pay made up 7% of total comp for women and more than double that for men. So this is something where we really need to start to focus some attention. What can we take out of the 2021 survey? First of all, the positive news. Despite the stresses of the pandemic, the gender wage gap did not increase. Some had predicted it would decrease because higher paid women stayed in the workforce and lower paid women got out of it, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And we also see that across our male and female pay, there was an increase in pay from 2019 of 12% for men and for women. So this was positive news. Employers were paying attention to their labor markets. The racial wage gap decreased. And finally, I think both the increase in the number of signers and the increase in participation and the increase in pay, overall pay that is covered by our survey this year, shows the commitment of the signers of the Boston Compact in the greater Boston area, a commitment to change, a commitment to trying to understand and then narrow the wage gaps, both for women in general and for racial wage gaps. There are challenges, however. Black and African American workers, as well as Hispanic and Latino women, continue to have the largest gender wage gaps year after year. Women earn significantly less than men in 7 out of 10 job categories. And finally, I think we really see from this data the need for everybody to dig in and pay attention to measuring wage gaps. Now, what am I talking about when I say measuring wage gaps? It's not equal pay for equal work. That's been the law in the United States since the 60s. And here in Massachusetts, it was reinforced in legislation 4 or 5 years ago. Equal pay for equal work calculations show whether at a given job, women are paid the same as men with some allowances for education and length of service and so forth. Wage gap measurements, however, are simpler than that and much more powerful. They take the aggregate of salaries paid to women, salaries and performance pay, depending on what you're looking at, paid to women versus that paid to men for the company as a whole. It's not, does everybody make the same at a given level? It's a measure of how women are advancing and how people of color are advancing in the workplace. So it's important for employers to do the math on this and look at the raw wage gap, because it tells them not only a bit about equal pay for equal work, which they can get from other calculations, but in general, where women are, where people of color are in the organization, and over time, how they're progressing. We recognize that the data here gets a little bit confused and confusing. The laws you're abiding versus what you want to know about how women and people of color are progressing. Boston Women's Workforce Council really understands how this can be difficult for people to look at and explain within their organizations. So we are really trying to help you. And I think some of you know that we've been working with you both individually and using various different calculations on our website. But I have good news. Come 2022, we are going to provide you on our website a wage gap calculator. All you have to do is put the numbers in and the wage gaps come flying out at you. Maybe not information you're happy to see at first, but information that you need. We look forward to working with all of you individually to help you understand your data and help you understand what you need to do to change your data. Thank you all for listening to this today. We'll be sending you copies of our report electronically. We're also doing some in-paper versions for those of you like me who like to hold something and look at the pictures and so forth. Now let me turn this session over to Ayanna Polk, who's the Communications and Outreach Manager at the Mayor's Office for Women's Advancement. Ayanna?
Thank you, Kathy. As the Communications and Outreach Manager at the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement, the public partner of the BWWC, it is my pleasure to join you today. Our mission is to promote gender equity by empowering women and removing systemic barriers to their advancement in the realms of representation, safety, and economic development. Our work with the BWWC is a part of a number of initiatives that shed light on the issues facing women today. We help legislators understand these issues and call upon them to prioritize gender and racial equity as an essential part to empowering our community. Next, we'll take an inspiring dive into the data results that we've just heard with a panel discussion led by Beth Chandler, President and CEO of YW Boston and a BWWC council member. YW Boston is a 100% talent compact signer that helps organizations create a more inclusive environment so women, people of color, and especially women of color can thrive at all levels. Beth?
Diana, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I am thrilled to be able to moderate today's panel. We have three wonderful panelists, so I am happy and looking forward to jumping right in. But first, let me introduce the panel to you. We have Edward Green, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Human Resource Officer at Iron Mountain. We have Joan Christel, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of Corporate Citizenship and Global Inclusion at State Street Corporation, and Shirley Leung, columnist and Associate Editor at the Boston Globe. And so we just were also able to hear from Kathy the results of the findings from the most recent wage gap. And I have to say, while there were some things that were, I guess, optimistic, there was certainly lots of information that was sobering. So with that said, I wanted to first ask Joan and then Edward if they could share, given what Kathy just shared, what are their reflections about what's happening at their organizations? What are they seeing? So Joan, you first.
Great. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be here on today's panel. So focusing on pay equity across our organization is something that's very important to us at State Street, and it's something that we carefully examine not only in terms of gender, but also with regard to race. And we also look at both the raw wage gap and the adjusted wage gap. And so for the adjusted wage gap, which as we know is the like for like comparison of men and women in the same job, we make adjustments, for factors such as job function or geography, since we're a global company, and we'll make adjustments as appropriate because this concept of equal pay for equal work really underpins our compensation philosophy. But then when we think about the raw wage gap, that's where this gets a lot trickier because we know the raw wage gap is ultimately all about the representation of women and employees of color in more highly paid and more senior levels of the organization. And so this is a big part of why we set very clear diversity goals as an organization to drive increased representation of women and employees of color. And that's not only at the top, but at all levels of the organization. And something else that I think is really critical is that we measure the performance of each executive at State Street against diversity goals that are specific to their organizations, and their compensation is adjusted accordingly. I would also say too, our board of directors has oversight of pay equity, and that's something they're very focused on, which I guess isn't a surprise. Our lead director is a woman, as is the chair of our board's Human Resources Committee. So while we've made some good progress, like many organizations, I think just kind of reflecting on these gender and racial wage gap findings, we know we have a lot more work to do to have more diverse representation. And I think we also have more work to do as an organization to help people understand the wage gap, understand the difference between the raw wage gap and the adjusted wage gap, and to understand why they're both important. And I think that's especially important for people managers to understand that, because they're really at the front lines of the decision making regarding compensation and all the other factors that impact representation. So that's really what I think about in relation to these findings.
Thank you, Joan. And Edward.
It always helps to unmute yourself, right? We should have mastered the Zoom protocols by now. I appreciate how Joan has kind of framed some of the issues happening there at State Street. I'm new to Iron Mountain as their new CHRO. So this is a journey that we're really looking to accelerate as we start looking at pay equity, as we start looking at gender and racial issues. Most recently, we hired a new Global Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. But I also have, being an African American and being the CHRO, I know specifically and directly some of these key issues. So the idea, I should lead with saying thank you for BWWC for driving the data and putting it front and center. And the takeaway from the data for me when I'm listening to Kathy is we have work to do, right? All of us. There's a real challenge. And hearing you, Joan, talk about some of the pathways that State Street has really engaged in, we at Iron Mountain are following similarly in that path. As we look at pay equity, as we really look at the data, what's the data telling us? And then how do we move forward? How do we incorporate that for our executives in terms of tying it to compensation to really ensure that we continue to move these issues forward? So lots of important work ahead of us, but it's good to hear that many of us are taking up the challenge.
Thank you, Edward. And Shirley, what are you seeing in the research that you do, the conversations you have? Are there any strategies that you're reading about that you're seeing that you think are helping to move, or at least to reduce these gaps?
Mm-hmm. So what I think I want to jump off of what Edward was saying about data. I believe data drives change in this town, and what the council's doing, the findings and the compact, that's what we need more of. And there are a growing number of local companies that are doing their own data work and diversity work and setting goals and then telling the public about them. They're putting on their website, they're running reports about it. And, I think about what TJX has done, or Vertex, or Boston Scientific, HubSpot, to name a few. State Street has been doing this as well. And I think we'll probably be doing more of this. They've been such a leader on setting diversity goals. And I'm hoping that reporting this data can become the new bragging rights for corporate America. And it's up to the media, journalists like myself and others, to shine a spotlight on these numbers and hold companies accountable year to year.
So can I just comment on that, Shirley? Because data is extremely important, right? The quantitative component, but I also want to make sure that we don't lose the qualitative, because you can have all sorts of data that look, they look pretty on the slides, but that's not the experience of our employees, of our women, our people of color. So there is that, the both and. As we think about the data as an indicator, but we need to go beyond the data and be very holistic, which for me really ties into what's the culture of the company. What do we believe in? How do we show up? That then gets highlighted through that data, engagement surveys, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Edward, thank you. I was going to ask, because was going to be a second question I had to everyone on the panel, and thinking about the data. And that's one thing we talk about at YW. It has to be more than just the numbers, right? And so, Joan, wondering what are some things that you're doing at State Street to look at both the qualitative experience, like qualitative stories that people have, as well as what types of data are you looking at? Because diversity can be just counting people in groups, right? But that doesn't mean people feel included or that they belong. And so what are some other ways that your organization in particular, because I know, Edward, you just got to Iron Mountain, and surely you may be able to jump in as well, but how are you looking at people's experience, as well as do they feel like they're really included and belong to the organization?
Yeah, I think there are a few different dimensions to this. One certainly is just, the setting of diversity goals, as we're saying, and how are we tracking against those goals. But, Edward, I really love what you're saying, that it all goes back to culture. And so how are we understanding our culture? And a lot of that certainly can be done through things like employee engagement surveys, which is something that we're really committed to. We do a large survey every couple of years, but then we do multiple pulse surveys throughout the year. Earlier this year, we did a survey in the summer that was very focused on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging. And, we're still digesting the results of that survey. But I think for a lot of leaders, it was just really powerful to see a survey that was solely focused on those topics. And so, I think then also we're gathering information more informally through our relationships with things like the employee resource groups, employee networks. And I think at the end of the day, so much of it goes back to what are managers doing with their employees and how are they engaging their employees? How are they asking their employees about their experience? What's the kind of culture that a manager is creating on their own individual team? And how is that different or similar to the broader culture of the organization? And I think these are all things that need to be considered and discussed and kept top of mind at the top of the house, but also at the more individual team level, manager to employee.
Yeah, Joan, I think you've captured that beautifully. At Iron Mountain, one of the first things showing up there that I wanted to really focus on was the culture, and to really ensure that it was leader led. Right? There isn't a magic formula, right? As we start thinking about diversity holistically, it does require a point of view, a broad perspective that's all inclusive and engaging, to have the different voices represented. But it is the center of that, whether it's successful or not, is really looking at your management population. How are they showing up? How are they leading? How are we leading by example with the right kind of framework? And it's a day at a time, literally. I'm looking at this panel here. We all know what it's like as either women or people of color, day by day, right? It's you got to be in it every day.
I mean, ultimately, I think it's about organizations making it comfortable for managers and employees at all levels to talk about diversity. And what I see is that, yes, all these companies may be reporting numbers, but are you talking about it, colleague to colleague? That can be an uncomfortable space. And I think the organizations that are far along on this diversity journey and closing the wage gap, they're willing to go there and talk about, how much people make, or should we be asking for raises? I know this happens a lot in among women journalists. We talk about this a lot. Whether it's the Globe or anywhere else, we talk about how can we empower ourselves. And so I think we all need to get comfortable with closing the wage, our role in closing the wage gap, and or our role in diversifying our companies.
Shirley, I think you raise a really good point in getting people to think about what is the agency that they have, right? Because I think Edward and Joan both talked about the roles of leadership, which is extraordinarily important in moving the needle. But you have to have everybody along the way who's engaged and who feel like they have agency in this as well. And so I'd love to hear from Joan and Edward, what are some things that you are doing that help with that disconnect? I think the BWWC had Professor Hannah Bowles here to talk about the disconnect often between leadership, who says, this is what we want to do, and then you're relying on your managers to actually implement, and they don't know what they're doing. And so we at YW actually have a program to help mid to senior level leaders feel like they have agency and the skills through our Lead Boston program, because we knew that was an issue. And would love to hear what's happening at State Street, and even Edward, what you might be thinking at Iron Mountain to really help give mid to senior level managers both the knowledge and the skills to be more inclusive leaders.
Yeah, I love this question, Beth, this whole topic, because I think if or when we close the wage gap, I think it's really going to be because of frontline managers who are at the forefront of all that decision making on all of the topics that directly impact the wage gap, which as we know, it's not just compensation, it's hiring, it's promotions, it's culture, professional development. And so at State Street, we're very focused on making sure that managers have the supports that they need, that they have training, that they have unconscious bias training, certainly, but also that they have compensation training, that they're prepared every year when they're making pay decisions. But again, this isn't just a once a year topic. Pay equity is something that it's part of this day-to-day decision making. And so, we also have policies that we give managers the support to carry out. Things like one of our key policies is that we have a global policy that we don't ask prospective employees or job applicants about their pay history. And that's in an effort to avoid perpetuating any past pay inequities. And so that's something that we do globally. So even in the jurisdictions where we could be asking that question, we choose not to. And, we're giving managers the supports, we're communicating these policies and making sure that they feel equipped to carry them out, because as we're saying, they're really at the front lines of these pay equity decisions. It's something they're doing day to day, and that would really be my encouragement to all the managers out there, to really be mindful of pay equity in your daily decision making, and to recognize the hugely important role that you play, and that you really can be a change agent around this issue.
Yeah, so Joan, similarly on our end, you're really highlighting education, right? How do we educate our leaders, our managers, those on the front lines, specifically around these issues around pay equity? I mean, if you think about managers today, think about what they are dealing with, right? You've got social unrest, racial issues, a pandemic. And then you have the regular business as usual, right? Getting the job done. And we have a responsibility to help educate and support our managers and give them the tools to be able to navigate through all of this. We at Iron Mountain are going to be launching in 2022 a leadership essentials program to really help our managers with different modules specifically around race and gender, and managing a hybrid workforce. All of those kind of key tools that are necessary. Specific to pay equity, it has to be, I'm one that believes you have to have things in the frontal lobe, right? You have to put it in front and then help people solve those issues, but they first got to be aware of it, and we have to stay with it. It's not the flavor of the month, right? This is a long-term commitment to how do we build an engaging and diverse and productive workforce. And that's one of the reasons I love the job that I'm in, because my role, along with leadership, we have an ability and the capability to actually influence that.
Thank you. I'm going to shift it a little bit. And Shirley, I want to ask you, Edward just talked about, we're now having a hybrid workforce. And I'm wondering, in the research that you've been doing, the conversations you're having, what are your thoughts about how a hybrid workforce might either help or hinder the gaps that we're seeing?
It's a double-edged sword. A lot of women will probably take advantage of and the opportunity to work from home more. And my fear is that what happens is the women will stay home and the men will go to work. They're just, they're used to the dynamic. And so as a result, you don't want to suddenly have all male newsrooms or all male workforces reappear. And so companies have to be really intentional about the hybrid workplace. They have to monitor who comes back to work, how many days a week. I know some companies are looking at, there's been some research on, advancement and promotions of those who work remotely and those who come into the office. And so companies have to be mindful that they're not, inadvertently only promoting the people who show up in the office. And perhaps more of them are men. And so there's a lot of intentionality that has to happen with the hybrid workplace.
And Joan and Edward, I see you both nodding your heads. Are there things that you've been thinking about at your respective institutions that are keeping that in mind?
Yeah, I would say, just echoing Shirley's comments, I think it's all about understanding what's really going on. And so I think this gets back to this whole idea of measurement, of understanding, okay, who are the different groups that are coming in the office, and how are we training managers to think about that so that no one's advantaged or disadvantaged because of certain situations. And so I think at this, at this stage, I think we're continuing to just kind of get a handle on, on what are people doing as they embrace this, new hybrid environment, and hearing from people about what's working. I think just listening to employees has become so important in this, and understanding what people's needs are, and not thinking that we know what their needs are, but really hearing from them what their needs are, and and taking steps to support them with our policies and also our practices.
Yeah, I don't want to lose something that Shirley, that you said, which I think is so key: intentionality. I think if we've learned anything through this pandemic that we are still in, is to be very intentional, right? And Joan, to your point, listening to our employees, actually listening and being intentional about that. And then what are we hearing? And then how do we address it proactively? The whole idea of going hybrid, I view it as a great equalizer, particularly being in a global company. You really do, it does kind of level set for all employees. But Shirley, to your point, you have to be very intentional on how you manage that, right? And read the signs, pay attention to the data. But I think it creates a wonderful opportunity to create greater access as long as you are being very intentional about it.
And talking about the hybrid model, that certainly came out for many because of COVID-19 and needing to have people working from home. Are there other policies, practices that came up for your respective organizations because of response or responding to COVID-19 that either you're going to continue or that you may be getting rid of?
Well, I would just throw out two things that we're exploring related to the hybrid model. One is no video Fridays, right? That idea of, I can participate, but I can do it in my sweats, right? I don't have hair to worry about, but as some say, don't have to do your hair. And the other is really thinking about when meetings happen. So really not doing meetings, before 9:30 or after 3, to really be able to account for kids going back to school, the drop-offs, the pickups. Again, this ties back to Shirley's point, being very intentional. And we're trying to look at different segments of our workforce. How do we make sure everybody has the opportunity to engage fully in this kind of new framework? Just a couple of things that we are thinking about implementing. Joan, I don't know if you guys may already have done it.
No, we're doing some of those same things about really being more intentional about the meeting times, about trying to not start them before a certain time or have them go later, and or have like alerts come up to say maybe you should think about sending this email at a different time, or experimenting with blocking off maybe like Friday afternoon with no meetings. I love the no video camera idea. I might have to take that one back. I think that's great. But I think really this gets back to culture change again. And so, you can say we're not going to have meetings on Friday afternoons, but until that really becomes part of the culture, you're still going to have meetings on Friday afternoons. And so I think those are things that, again, happen not only just corporately, but within teams, that our managers kind of setting the tone, setting the example, and really holding their team to that. And so those are a lot of the things that we're talking about and exploring at State Street.
Can I add something too? I want to put a plug in for the childcare infrastructure. I hope the pandemic shows us that we really need to have a robust childcare infrastructure, whether it's more employees paying for it, the government paying for it. And then and part of that too is that I'm hoping that what comes out of the pandemic is that, because of these hybrid work policies and more men working from home, working fathers working from home, that men will pick up more of those childcare and household duties, and it will feel like a more equal distribution of domestic duties. And that in the end will also help women close that women rise faster and close that wage gap.
Beth, there's one other piece that I just want to make sure we don't forget. So we talk a lot about the hybrid model and, returning to the office. There's a whole segment of the population that has been out in the field, remain out in the field. I know at Iron Mountain, that's the largest part of our population that's on the front line that hadn't had the option, right, to work from home. And that's another area that we're exploring deeper, trying to be very intentional of how do we help that part of the workforce navigate this new reality that we're operating in.
Right. And Shirley, I know at one point you were also talking about frontline workers. Are there any things that you've been seeing or hearing about that people are doing to provide support to folks that really can't and never did have the opportunity to work remotely?
I mean, it's really what Edward is saying is companies looking at their workforces and making sure that policies, work for everyone, or they're not designing policies that only work for one segment of the workforce. And if there's flexibility being offered to, the white collar workers, what can we do for the workers who have no choice but to come into the office every day? What can we provide for them? And I think a lot of companies are looking at that through that. Now that the kind of the throes of now that we're out of kind of emergency mode with the pandemic, I think companies are taking a step back and looking at how do we more evenly roll out a hybrid workplace, or how do we more evenly treat our workers given this new reality of flexible work rules?
Great. So I'm going to end with one question. I'm going to ask each of you this one question. So we've talked a lot about, and you've all shared some really specific things that I think the audience can take away today and go back to their organizations and actually think about how do I implement some of these things. And also wanted to ask a sort of a bigger question, which is, given that we have a new administration in the city of Boston, are there any policies that you think that the administration might want to consider that could support organizations in creating more equitable workplaces?
I think Mayor Wu should get more companies to sign the compact, right? We need even bigger tent and bigger pool. And so I'd love to see her do that. And, being, the first woman elected mayor of Boston, and a woman of color. I've got to think she champions closing the gender wage gap more than her predecessors. So that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that the compact will see an infusion of employers signing up.
I would agree with that too. I think that the compact is really a key way to move this forward in our city. I think it's an incredible effort that I'm so proud to be a part of. And so, yeah, I think if we could use this as this historic moment to get more folks to sign on and to share the data, to have more transparency, to share those results, I think that could really affect change in a wonderful way.
I would agree with everything that was stated. Beth, I might push it out a little further. The fact that we now have a mayor who is a person of color, that really all of our policies really get reviewed from a person of color's experience and perspective, because it's very different, right? As we look at data, we know how data can be interpreted, but that we really kind of flip it on its head and look at it from a different perspective. And I'm hoping that Mayor Wu and her cabinet, take advantage of a different experience and bring that to bear for the city of Boston. So it's not more of the same, but that we use this as an opportunity to leap forward.
On that note, I'm going to thank you all. This has really been a terrific conversation. We could probably go on for another 30 minutes, if not half a day, coming up, sharing the great strategies that you're doing and the wonderful research and things that you're seeing, Shirley. So thank you all again. And thank you again to the BWWC for allowing me to moderate such a fantastic panel.
Thank you so much, Beth. Thank you so much for chairing this panel on our conference. And thank you for your leadership here in Boston and in the nation as a whole. Your voice is so often heard and necessary as we go through the transition to a more equitable country and a more equitable city. So thank you, Beth. It's now my pleasure and honor to introduce this year's keynote speaker for the BWWC Effective Practices Conference, Reshma Kewaramani, MD and CEO of Vertex Pharmaceuticals. Vertex is an anchor signer of the Boston Compact, having joined with us in the movement to end gender and racial wage gaps in 2013. It's a while ago. To have achieved this position of CEO as a woman, CEO of a major company in the highly competitive world of pharmaceutical science, Reshma has by definition a wealth of both experience in the field and education. She joined Vertex in 2017 after a significant career at Amgen. She became Chief Medical Officer of Vertex and Executive Vice President of Global Medicine prior to her elevation to CEO. She holds a medical degree with honors from Boston University. She completed her training at the two major Boston academic medical centers, MGH and the Brigham, that are now known as MGB. And she also completed the general management program at Harvard Medical School. But beyond that amazing expertise and education, Reshma stands out because of her passion for improving the lives of patients and addressing the diseases that strike rarely but have incredible consequences. If any of you have a family member who suffers from cystic fibrosis, as I do, you know how the medicine that Vertex developed and has improved over the years under Reshma's leadership, how that medicine has changed the lives of people debilitated by this potentially tragic inherited disease. She's also committed to developing and supporting the next generation of scientists and to giving back to her community. She's on the board of the Biomedical Science Careers Program, which is dedicated to supporting underrepresented students in the STEM fields. And she's on the board of RISE Massachusetts, a nonprofit foundation focused on ending the opioid epidemic. And I should also note that she sits on the board of MGH, which she has referred to as her alma mater in medicine. Reshma, we are so looking forward to your comments here today.
Thank you, Kathy, for that very warm introduction. I appreciate everything you do. It's been such a pleasure to get to know you over the last couple of years. You are a role model to so many in the community, including myself. It is an absolute pleasure to be with all of you today, albeit virtually. I want to start by acknowledging and recognizing the team at the Boston Women's Workforce Council and their important work to achieve pay equity for the working women in our Commonwealth. That's why I am so proud that we at Vertex are an Anchor Talent Compact signer. It's important for us to contribute, advance, and collectively understand how we can all do better for working women in Massachusetts. To that end, data sharing and transparency is a critical component, and it's the component that the BWWC has been driving towards. It's something we at Vertex take very seriously, and it is something that I genuinely believe will be the important key that unlocks equity for women in Massachusetts. I'm fortunate to be at the helm of a company that's been committed to and invested in this work for many years, actually several years before I became CEO. Inclusion, diversity, and equity are core to who we are at Vertex and core to our ability to create transformative medicines. It's not just the right thing to do, and it is. It's essential for our business. Inclusion, diversity, and equity allow us to make better decisions, to be more innovative, and to attract the best talent. I'd like to share 3 pillars that we're really proud of at Vertex as we make more progress to continue to address the gaps in equity and to continue to build a more inclusive culture. It all starts with our STEM programs, inspiring young women and students of color to pursue a career in STEM. And most importantly, to show them that they belong at places like Vertex, doing work, serving patients. Second, by recruiting underrepresented talent with partnerships with organizations like Bottom Line, BSCP, Europe, amongst others, to increase the diversity of our students who come through us through the Early Careers Program. Last year, 53% of new hires at Vertex were women. 44% were racial and ethnic minorities. And third, developing more women leaders through programs like I Will, our internal ERN or Employee Resource Network, mentorship programs, leadership development programs like Women Unlimited, and the partnership help us provide equitable access to development opportunities for women leaders at Vertex. In closing, I want to share one more story, my own story and my own journey from being an academic to becoming CEO at Vertex. And the common theme through the story is the importance of mentorship. It has played a far bigger role than I would have ever imagined, and more important than I could have ever thought possible. It's one of the reasons that I so deeply believe in mentorship and giving back. When I was an academic, when I was a fellow and a resident right here in Boston, I thought I would spend my entire career at the Massachusetts General Hospital and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And it turned out that my interest led me to biotechnology. But that move from academia to biotechnology, while incredibly exciting, was also scary. It involved taking risks, and it involved moving from the East Coast in Boston, place I consider home, all the way to California. And it was mentors at the Mass General Hospital and at the Brigham who gave me the courage and the support to make that big decision. When I got to my first company on the West Coast, I was assigned a mentor almost the first week that I got there. And I think it was quite a fortuitous, but nonetheless accidental connection. The company was having a big drive to ensure that new members of the community were joined with mentors. And that mentor who I was assigned that first week of joining the company remains a mentor to me today. What I gained from that individual was a different perspective. It was a different way to connect dots. It was a way to understand the world differently than from my vantage point. Those connections, those perspectives, that push to do something that seemed risky and the support to take on a next step that seemed scary were beyond important to me as a young physician in the industry. When I came to Vertex, I was again very fortunate to meet another community that supported me and more mentors that encouraged me. My predecessor, Jeff Leiden, saw something in me before I saw it in myself when he approached me to think about a next role of becoming CEO at Vertex. Mentorship is about a two-way street. It's about giving and about learning. It's something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and it's something that I'm very committed to. As we strive for equity, for women and underrepresented minorities, for pay equity, and in all other domains, data transparency and mentorship can be two tools in our toolbox to get us where we all want to be. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And with that, let me pass it back over to Kim.
Thank you, Reshma, for your thoughtful words and your leadership at Vertex, proving that closing the power gap by advancing women is a dynamite business strategy. In closing, I want to thank all our speakers and special guests today. As our data showed, we still have work to do to close the gender and racial wage gaps in Boston. There is an opportunity, however, to use the lessons learned during the pandemic to change the workplace of the new normal and make it more equitable for all. The Boston Women's Workforce Council is your go-to resource to make this happen. We have the data, the research, and the passion. Together, we will do it. You'll be receiving our annual report soon and ask you to review it carefully. We are in a moment in time where big changes can occur, and keeping efforts to eliminate the gender and racial wage gap top of mind in your organization is where we can help. Please contact us to assist you in calculating your own internal gender and racial wage gap numbers. Use our community snapshot as a benchmark for your organization's metrics. Come to our briefing sessions to hear the latest research to close these gaps. Finally, let us know what policies to support pay equity work at your organization, and importantly, those that don't. It is through the sharing of best practices that we will eventually find the ideas that move the needle. We look forward to working with you in 2022 and thank you again for your continued support. Have a great rest of your day.